Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the fourth technical webinar in the webinar series of Advanced organized by EATRIS. Advanced is an innovative and focused learning program for future developers of ATMPs. It is funded by the Erasmus Plus Project Fund of the European Union. My name is Merel Ax, and I will be hosting this webinar for you today. The presenters of this webinar for today are Professor Isabel Leuven and Francis Arix. The topic of this webinar is market access of gene therapy, which deals with the reimbursement phase of this innovative type of therapy. Please note that the session is being recorded. The recording will be made available at the website of EATRIS very soon. If you have questions during the webinar, you can type them in during the webinar in the question box. Please type in your questions and then press send. If you would have follow-up questions after this webinar, you can always email advance@eatris.eu. And then for some of you who are GoToWebinar first-timers, a bit of info on the control panel. If you click on the orange mark, you can hide the control panel, so you have a better view on the presenters and the people who are talking. And then on top of your screen, you can see webinar viewer, and we will propose that you choose the option view who's talking. Then you will only see the person who is presenting. Okay, let me introduce the two speakers of today. First of all, there is Professor Dr. Isabel Huis, who is a full professor at KU Leuven at the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Sciences. She's specialized in regulatory sciences, including intellectual property rights and market access strategies of medicines. Our second presenter of today is Francis Arix, who is the head of the Directorate Reimbursement of Medicines and Pharmaceutical Policy within the Healthcare Department of the National Institute for Health and Disability Insurance, the NIHD RISIF INAMI, in Belgium, where he manages the departments responsible for administrative and scientific assessment and appraisal of reimbursement claims for medicines. Then I will now give the screen to the first presenter of today, which is Francis Arix.
Okay, so welcome. My name is Francis Arix. I'm a very simple pharmacist and I work for RISIF INAMI in Belgium, which is the National Institute for Health and Disability Insurance in Belgium. I have to hide my screen a little bit because Isabel is in my way. Okay, I'm going to be talking about, or I was asked to be talking about pricing and reimbursement of pharmaceuticals or of ATMP in Belgium. So I have to warn you a little bit. This is going to be about pricing and reimbursement, and certainly about reimbursement of medicines, including advanced therapies, because we do not make any difference between innovative therapies or other medicines and advanced therapies, ATMPs in Belgium. So I'm going to give you just some insights in the basic principles and the basic procedures for pricing and reimbursement. The thing is that probably a few of the more technical and more advanced techniques that we use are going to be used in ATMPs, and that is where the second part of this lecture is going to be about. So pricing and reimbursement of pharmaceuticals in Belgium. This is not moving, it is moving. So the National Institute for Health and Disability Insurance, why do I have to say something about that? Well, because of, and that is a typical Belgian situation, reimbursement of medicines in Belgium, including reimbursements of ATMPs, is in Belgium part of the social security system, which is organized and managed by actually 7 different institutes for social security. One of these institutes is the National Institute for Health and Disability Insurance, which is part of social security, manages the compulsory health insurance in Belgium. So all Belgians are actually covered by health insurance for independents or for employed people. and it does two things, or more things, except of the arrangement or the arrangement or the organization of the access to healthcare. It also manages the stakeholders like the hospitals, the insurance agencies, what we call in Belgium mutualities. So it has it's part of the social security system, not like, for instance, NHS in UK, which is National Health Service. In other countries, healthcare or health insurance might be organized a little bit different. And we have a very inclusive system. That means that all stakeholders are included or are part of the process and part of the decision process. You have to remind yourself the whole time that actually the National Institute for Health and Disability Insurance, so the civil servants, do not take any decision themselves. It's actually a series of committees and commissions that make the decisions, where all the stakeholders, academics, doctors, pharmacists, also the industry is represented. It's them who make proposals for the minister. The minister makes the decision. The administration also only does the scientific support, the logistic support, administrative support. We serve the coffee, but we also do the legal advice and do the legal preparation. Reimbursement of medicines process, that is more general in different countries. It's actually a three-step process. There's the health technology assessment part, the evaluation of the value of the drug, then a technical proposal, what is called the appraisal phase. You'll see that a little bit later in a few slides. An appraisal phase where we try to translate the value of the drug into a technical proposal value proposal or valorization of that estimated or assessed value of that drug, and for which type of patients do we want to reimburse that drug, at what price, at what cost, what are the specificities of the doctors or the physicians that can actually use the drug, that sort of technicities. And then the last part is the decision part, which is a political part in Belgium. It's not the case in all the countries. In Ireland, for instance, it's actually the administration that makes the decision. In Germany, for instance, it's a federal decision, principal decision on reimbursement or not for certain drugs, but it's the lender and it's actually the Krankenkassen, the mutualities or the insurance agencies that make the decision. In Belgium, it's different. In Belgium, it's a political decision. It's the minister who decides on reimbursement or not, based on a proposal based on a technical proposal coming from a commission, coming from Risivinami. So here you join actually three angles. You have the science coming from the HTA, the financing part, the budgeting part, the financial part coming from the technical proposal, and then the political part, public opinion part coming from the minister. So here you see that process. It's a bit in the corner, in the right bottom corner, because I'm going to add a few topics on that type of slide, and it's on that slide, and it's going to come back a few times. So we have a three-step process: the red part, the yellow part, and the blue part. The green part is a little bit separated. I'm not going to go very deep into that, but in parallel with the decision on the reimbursement of drugs in Belgium, we have a decision on a pricing, and that decision is made by another minister, the Minister of Economic Affairs, in parallel with the HTA part. So remember, we had a three-step process: an assessment phase, evaluation phase, the HTA, Health Technology Assessment, the red part. For that, we have 90 days. Then a proposal phase, a technical appraisal, a technical proposal or an appraisal phase, the yellow part, and then the blue part, where the Minister of Social Affairs, the Minister of Health, the Minister of Budget, also the Minister of Finances, make their decision based on the proposal coming from the Commission of Reimbursement of Drugs. The thing that you see in the middle, the CRM here, is the commission that does the HTA work, so the assessment work and the proposal work. We have a very much, you see two gray parts before, in the end, after the decision of the minister, the technical proposal or the decision of the minister also has to take effect. That takes in Belgium also a couple of weeks and up to 2 months actually, because the decision of the minister has to be endorsed actually by the State of Council, and then has to be published in the National Gazette. So that takes a bit of time. That's one thing. And we have, and that is one of the very specific issues, but also one of the very specific elements of the Belgian procedure. We have a very much offer-based system, not demand-driven. We cannot start to study or to examine possible reimbursement of the drug before we have an application by the marketing authorization holder. So you have an earlier phase, which is marketing authorization, mostly done by EMA, a little bit by ATMPs, but mostly done by EMA, and certainly for ATMPs, always by the European Medicines Agency. And then we have to wait for an application by an applicant, by the company, before we can start. That takes up to 2 years actually before we have that. That's one of the reasons of the delay in access for Belgian people. So we have an offer-based system, not a demand-driven system. We work with positive lists, what is called nomenclature, but positive lists. We have a system of conditional and unconditional reimbursement, quite important, and I'm going to come back on that very soon now. And then we have a system of temporarily enlisting, and I'll explain a little bit later what that is. The most offer-based system that I already explained. Positive list, that means that we do not reimburse any drug or any actually any medical act, including drugs, if it is not on a positive list of reimbursed medical acts or reimbursed pharmaceuticals. So we have a list of all the drugs that we reimburse. All the other ones are not reimbursed. That's the theory. In practice, and that might change for the future also, and that might certainly be an option for the future for ATMPs, that we do not reimburse the acts themselves anymore. And we take a completely other approach where we actually do not buy drugs anymore, but we buy services, or you buy outcome. You buy a package deal from, for instance, a hospital, everything included, including diagnostics, including the therapy, including the follow-up of a patient. That might be a step forward or a step in the future that we take. It's actually something that we do already, for instance, for in vitro fertilization of patients or of women. Quite an important aspect of the Belgian and quite typical for Belgium is that thing about conditional or unconditional reimbursement. We have a tradition, a very long tradition of conditional reimbursement. It's called Chapter 4, that's not that important, but actually what it is that the minister decides upon, and before that it's the Commission of Reimbursement of Drugs that makes the proposal, decides on or chooses the condition in which the drug can be reimbursed for a certain patient. So that means that at that point, the minister or the commission can decide not to reimburse the drug in all circumstances. That would mean unconditional reimbursement, but limit the reimbursement to certain selected indications, or for a certain duration in time, or for a certain dosage, for a certain target population, only the women, only the children, or might set specific requirements for the expertise of the expert centers that can actually use that drug. That is certainly the case for ATMPs, where reimbursement is limited to some chosen based on their expertise, chosen expertise centers. So that's the system of conditional and unconditional reimbursement. Initially, that was meant to be a control mechanism, control for budget, but also control for efficacy or cost-efficient therapies. It has changed, or it is changing through digitalization, for instance, because the requests that we do or the collection of information that we do to check if the patient is can have the reimbursement or not, or the doctor can ask for the reimbursement or not. That used to be merely a control mechanism. It's now changing into a data collection, real world evidence, or real world, in the first step, real world data collection in real or in virtual registries. We do not want all the information anymore. We just want the experts, the doctors, the physicians to register some information about anonymized information about the condition of the patient in a registry, in a real or a virtual registry, to be able afterwards to check if, for instance, our therapies or the choices that we've made, the preferences that we've set for reimbursement of certain drugs, are compliant with reality, if we are actually treating the right patients, or and that's not really true, not if we're treating the right patients, but if we're aiming the reimbursement, so the financial access to the therapies, towards the right patients. If we're not reimbursing the drugs for women, for instance, where men might be more where it might be more efficient to reimburse the drugs for men. So to adapt our reimbursement system. So it's not a control mechanism anymore. It is evolving towards real world data collection. That might be of benefit in the long term, or that is of benefit in the long term. So that's the thing about conditional reimbursement. And then we have the other thing, the temporary enlisting, and probably the most spectacular, or certainly the most important part of the whole reimbursement system, and certainly the case for advanced therapies. It's called the managed entry agreements or managed entry arrangements. There's a lot of terms for that. It's actually the secret contracts that are signed between the minister, not the minister, between the institute, the National Institute for Health and Disability Insurance, and the marketing authorization holder, the company, for temporary access to that drug. That means that if there's doubts, or if the Commission of Reimbursement of Drugs is not able to make a proposal to set the scene for the reimbursement of that certain drugs in certain contexts, then it is possible to have negotiations in a smaller group than just the Commission of Reimbursement of Drugs, to have negotiations on temporary, for a duration of 3 years, 5 years maximum. Actually, that's renewable, but 3 to 5 years maximum, to enlist that drug anyway. For an important part, these arrangements are very much financial, because the price of, and that's again certainly the case for ATMPs, the price of these therapies might be very high, or might be not in equilibrium with the value of that drug. Basically, for all the drugs, we use 5 criteria. There's the therapeutic added value, there's the positioning of the drugs in the available therapeutic arsenal, there's the price, there's the budget impact, and there's the cost efficiency. That's the 5 criteria. If the price is disproportionate towards the value, for instance, it is still possible to enlist the drugs through a managed entry arrangement or managed entry agreement, whatever you want to call it. So at that point in time, we reimburse the drug, and depending on the price, there's a certain clawback or a certain refund by the company, and the drug can be enlisted anyway for a certain amount of time, while the company is actually gathering more data, more evidence to clarify the real value of that drug, and to try to demonstrate why it would be worth the price that the company is asking for it. So that's one of the solutions that are there. the managed entry agreements. So these managed entry agreements, although at the end they always have the impression or give the impression that they're very much financial based, they always actually have 4 components. There's always a value or an outcome or performance-based reimbursement based on the added value, based on really hard evidence. There's a risk-sharing component. You have it is obvious that the evidence that we have at the moment that we have to make a decision is evidence that is coming from clinical trials, which is in very well set conditions and the patient is optimally followed up versus, well, actually we reimburse the drug in real life. So the patient is not going to be, well, he is going to be followed up, but not in optimal conditions. The patient might not be that compliant to the therapy as in clinical trials circumstances. So that type of risk is shared between. We do not know the numbers of patients, the real numbers of patients. So risks on budget or budget impact and risk on does the evidence in real life, will that reflect the evidence that is coming from clinical trial? That risk is shared between, or we try in the managed entry agreement to share that risk between the company on the one hand and the commission on the other hand. So and the social security on the other hand. There's always the element in the managed entry agreement of the willingness to pay on a patient level for a certain therapy. What is society willing to pay per patient if the drug does what it promises to do? Without regarding or without having, well, without taking into account what the company is asking for the drug. So it's very well what you know the whole discussion that is going on at this point in time on Zolgensma, where in Belgium the company, and that's worldwide, the company is asking 2 million euro for a therapy. It is not certain that society or the commission or the minister is willing to pay 2 million euro for one patient. And then there's another type of willingness to pay, the willingness to pay from a societal perspective, and that is taking into account the budget limitations. You only have that much money that you can spend on healthcare, and from the money that you can spend on healthcare, you only have that much money that you can spend on pharmaceuticals. So you have to prioritize, you have to set preferences, you have to make choices. There's limits on that. So you have 4 elements. Those 4 elements are gathered in those. There's actually always gathered, they're always assembled in the decision of in the proposal from the Commission of Reimbursement of Drugs, but they're certainly and very explicitly present when we make managed entry arrangements or managed entry agreements or contracting or performance-based, value-based, outcome-based reimbursements. So that's where we are today, and where are we going very fast in the future. Well, you have now one process, and everything is done by one commission, the Commission of Reimbursement of Drugs, Commission for Reimbursement, that's CRM. But actually the task of the CRM, the task of that commission is very much double. It's on the one hand the scientific part. Remember, a decision on reimbursement of drugs is a mix of science and then the finances and then the political part. Commission for Reimbursement of Drugs has to take care of 2 parts, the science part, HTA, and then the proposal part, the financial part at the same time. In the future, we think that we're going to go in the direction of a split of those 2 parts. Science remains science, financial part is financial translation of value. So we're going in the direction of splitting that. That would be much more logical. It's been done in other countries also. It is what Zorginstituut Nederland does in the Netherlands. It is what Autorité de Santé does in France. It's separate. It's what TLV does. It's what NICE does, separate from the science part, is separate from the proposal part. It would have a big benefit, because at that point in time, today, all the health technology assessments have to be done by Belgium, by the same commission, by the National Institute for Health and Disability Insurance, the national experts that do the support of the commission. We have to do everything ourselves. And if you look at all the drugs that we have to deal with in a year, that's a bit more than 1,200 per year, of which more or less 50 that are really complicated and a few ATMPs. So we do not have all the expertise in-house or even in Belgium. So if we split that part, we can work towards more international collaboration. There's initiatives on the European level, like UNETA, like MEDEF, like a new international HTA organization that has been or is being set up actually at this point in time by the European Commission. That type of HTA, health technology assessment, could be inserted in a process where the red part and the yellow part, so the HTA part and the appraisal part, are split. We could use reports, HTA reports that are made in Sweden or in the Netherlands or in Austria or in Ireland. And actually, that is something that we are already doing. There are, for instance, and it's not the only one, there is, for instance, the Benelux initiative, which is an initiative between Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Ireland, and Austria, working together, amongst others, on pricing and reimbursement, and joint managed entry arrangements, some joint contracting, but also working together on HTA, and that's actually already operational. We already use assessment reports based on the expertise and based on reports that have been made in Austria, in Netherlands, or jointly with Netherlands and Austria, or jointly with Ireland. That's not the only initiative. There's also initiatives with the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland are working together, are producing HTA reports that we can use, and the other way around. So that's probably also for, and certainly for ATMPs, one of the future steps. The basic problem of pricing and reimbursement for drugs, and I have to look at my timing, I think, is actually the big difference, or the big issue is always the price. It's not entirely correct. It's not only the price, it's the relation between price, value, and cost. If you look at a new iPhone or at an iPhone, it's going to, I know this is not the newest one, but the price is going to be about 1,500 euro, I think. The real cost of production of an iPhone like that is something like $400, I think, or $450, nothing more than that. And the value might differ a lot. It's actually, it depends on who it is. For me, it's a very good iPhone. It's a very good iPhone. It's a very good smartphone. It's worth, for me, a good smartphone, but I'm not a very hip person. So I do not want the latest of the latest. So I'm not going to be willing to pay more than 500 euros for that. The hipsters amongst us, for them, who always want the latest new thing, it's probably worth, the value is probably going to be 1,500 euros. And for my father, who is 80 years old, it's a very expensive telephone. So maybe it's worth the value is only 100 euro or 150 euro, something like that. What Social Security has to do, what the Commission of Reimbursement has to do, is try to find the equilibrium or the balance between what is the price that the company is asking for, what's the real cost of production, and what is the value for society, and what is the value for an individual patient. And we have to try, or what the Commission has to try to do, is find a system to join these three or find the balance between these three. There are techniques for that, and Isabel, Professor Huys is going to go into a bit deeper into that. We have been in Belgium, but not only in Belgium. I'll give you an example of another study a little bit later. Have been looking for new innovative funding solutions for instance, ATMPs in Belgium, and looking at other ways to look at financing, other ways at budgeting, on how can we cope with the ever-rising prices and the budget impact of the financing of these types of drugs. And one of the studies that has been done was by Innovate, collaborating with the Vlerik School, coming up with a number of systems. And I'm not going to go into detail on that, but that too much details on that. But here you can see a few of the solutions that have been found. You could make the best possible use of the outcome-based or outcome-based managed entry arrangements, but you could go into the direction of just actually do not pay for the drug anymore, just buy the patent, buy the drug. A bit what we have been doing, or partially are doing with the COVID vaccines today. That's called, or that's one of the possibilities for intellectual property acquirement. Actually, you could reinsure actually your healthcare insurance. There's a lot of techniques that are there. The strange thing is that when we were doing that type of exercise, the London School of Economics was doing a similar exercise and doing a study on financing high-cost curative therapies. And they actually came up with, and this is just a detail of the right part of that slide, came actually up with the same solutions. So amortization, installments, annuities, instead of paying for the whole sum of that drug in one time, spread the payment of the therapy over time. Optimize your outcome-based payments. You see there the reinsurance. You see the intellectual property-based payment models. And you see the reserve funds or the specific funds for specific therapies. We'll probably in the discussion go a bit deeper on these proposals or these solutions, but that's it for me at this point in time. I'll give the slides now to Isabel. Which should work.
Okay, thanks a lot for this very nice introduction, first part of this lecture, and indeed a great starting point for the next part of this webinar. Can you hear me well?
Yes,
I do.
Okay. So indeed, pricing and reimbursement of ATMPs follow indeed the different procedures just explained to you all, but understanding the challenges related to pricing and reimbursement of ATMPs, and more in particular the gene therapies, asks for us to have a closer look at the exact type of or the nature of these products, and that is what you see here in front of us. We know that ATMPs consist of somatic cell therapies, might be gene therapies, tissue engineered products, or a combination of it, all with the ultimate aim of offering a cure to diseased people. And in the past, indeed, ATMPs have been developed and also offered for patients along a lot via hospitals. And it's only since 2012, around that the industrial commercialization of ATMPs became more prominent. Like for instance, here you see that different gene therapies and cell therapies and tissue engineered products have been offered, have been approved by the European Medicines Agency. Actually, 9 ATMPs were approved, and some of these therapies have gained entrance into the national systems following the let's say the main procedures as was explained earlier in different countries, so different ways of having access to different countries. But some products, like for instance Libera, disappeared from the market. And for instance, in Belgium, a CAR T-cell therapy, Kymriah, has been approved for reimbursed actually at the Belgian level. But this is a unique type of medicine, if you want, that indeed is possible to offer a cure for patients in certain instances only after one single dose. And it is very unique in a way that it's built upon a concept by extracting the cells, manipulating them, changing them, and then reintroducing them to the patients. So it's also, as was earlier said, a very specific type of medicines, but offering great promise also for a healthcare system, namely long-term savings. And but aside from that, there are unproven risks and benefits at the long term, as well as very high upfront costs that need to be paid by our healthcare systems. So that's really a challenge that we need to address. And how the regulators deal with that at the regulatory level, because we know that the ATMPs are approved at the central level by the European Medicines Agency. Most of these types of therapies are approved under a conditional marketing authorization. Sometimes when it is, for instance, also under special conditions. And in certain instances, accelerated assessment processes may also be coming into the picture. But that type of authorization implies that approval is based on limited clinical evidence that has been offered at that time of approval to the regulators. And that limited amount of clinical evidence is there and is also what is offered to the national agencies that do the health technology assessment that decide about the reimbursement of these therapies. So for the national agencies, it's very difficult to assess the value and also to predict the budget impact of that type of medicines, knowing that there are a lot of clinical uncertainties. And that's why national agencies deal differently with these type of therapies in terms of reimbursements, leading sometimes to limited or very heterogeneous access to patients to these type of therapies. So although there are long-term, the long-term safety and efficacy is largely unknown for these novel breakthrough type of therapies, prices upfront might be very high. We talk about numbers like 300,000, but also sometimes ranging over millions per treatment. And what are now the drivers for such high prices? That's maybe important to understand in order to see what are the causes of this, and how do we need to understand this. So from a company point of view, it makes sense to put a high price if you, for instance, have only a small market that you can target and from which the income will be much smaller than if you have a large market. And especially if you know that, for instance, competition is around the corner, not for exactly the same product, because most probably there are patents or other intellectual property rights related to that, but other types of new innovative therapies that maybe target the same market. And indeed, the companies also know that, and they want to be recognized by the value that they produce to patients, to the society, based on the medicines that they offer, which are in many cases have a very higher efficacy than what is the state of the standard of treatment at that moment, or sometimes there is no standard of treatment. And indeed, as companies very often rely or have intellectual property rights, exclusivity rights, that may bring them in a position of a high price negotiation power, in towards these discussions. And from a payer point of view, for long there was a willingness to pay for medicines, especially if it was for medicines in an for unmet medical needs. But that indeed comes under pressure and is on the long run also unsustainable, such high prices. And here we come into the point where we need to dive a little bit deeper into the different options that are there to solve these issues, to solve the uncertainties, and to solve also the topic of affordability or lack of affordability. So as the first speaker has highlighted, different groups have looked into different solutions to come up, like for instance, the Vlerick Business School and the London School of Economics. And some of these are presented here. So there is an advice to start early dialogues between the companies that develop ATMPs and the regulators and the payers, and to start on talking about agreements and taking advice from each other, and to de-risk certain investment that will be made into the development of these, and also to provide or to agree upon ways of offering access to the patients in the end once the ATMP is approved or is reimbursed. Another way, and actually that of early dialogues is something very interesting. I think it's very good that people can learn from each other, that they understand each other as well, and it might be good that certain things are obligatory as well, that clear dialogues will be installed up front. Another way is public-private partnerships. We have heard that already a lot. It occurs also a lot already on a pre-competitive scale, but here we are talking about public-private partnerships in the development phase, so in the drug development phase, which is not very a common practice as we are there in the more competitive sphere. But it might be good there or the suggestion is to come up there with upfront agreements on, for instance, shared models of costs, shared models of risk sharing, and also providing access to the developed drugs. A third one is partnerships between the payers at the national level. And we saw already such initiatives like the Benelux initiative, where the experiences and also the approaches and the strategies between the payers are exchanged amongst themselves to align early dialogues that are happening at the national level, and to harmonize as well certain models that are used or installed at the national level about the valuation of ATMPs. Important is also to strengthen or to insist on the publication of commercial trial results, to communicate about it, and to create or increase transparency about this. And then we are coming to a last type of model that is explained in literature. It's about intellectual property-based payment models. And that might be interesting to have a more deep dive into it, because people talk a lot about this, but sometimes there are confusions going on. So intellectual property rights, there are different types of intellectual property rights. You see here in front of you, one of the most important ones is patents, because that may protect the compound itself. For instance, in terms of ATMPs, it's a cell, or it's a gene, or another type of product, but also trademarks, database rights related to these products, and supplementary protection certificates, other exclusivity rights. So this is a large scale of different types of rights that are there to prevent third parties that have not the consent of the owner of making and using and offering that type of product. So it's really a negative right, not a positive right. It's not a right for someone to put a price, for instance, very high. It's only a negative right. And based on that, different models have been proposed in literature. For instance, the IP ownership transfer model, where the government pays the company for the patents, and the patent ownership then transfers from the company to the government, giving then the government the opportunity to use it for the common good as a public good. Then we have and this is actually an idea that comes up with, and which makes then use of, there should be some money available, which then could be, for instance, gathered in prize funds, where you could think of in the context of late stage or approved drugs that have been proven or studied yet, the funding comes then from such prize funds. Another type of model is the shared ownership model, whereby there is a partnership between the private and the public entity, for instance, also the government, stepping in, agreeing early on who will own what and how will the patent rights being exploited. And we can see certain examples in the medicines for malaria venture. It's a public-private partnership where in certain instances on a case-by-case, this type of model has been explored or executed. And then we have an IP licensed model, whereby the IP is licensed out on a multi-year contract-based modality, and where fixed payments are installed in a tender-like agreement, and which is actually a fixed a volume, where the price actually and the volume is actually de-linked from each other. Another type, these were actually voluntary licensing agreements, but there is also in literature a model which is called the compulsory licensing model. That's a mandatory licensing agreement installed or imposed by the government in certain instances. And these instances depend on national law. Might be that in one particular country, public health interest might be a reason for mandating such license agreement and providing access to the medicine. And then indeed there is also the patent-free model, where indeed patents are not taken, and where the IP, because it's not because there is no IP right that there is no IP, where the IP indeed becomes publicly available and even accessible for the common good. And that's also how the polio vaccine became widely used in our society. So these types of models based on IP have their advantages. They might you might think of having a shift in control if IP is transferred from the company to the government, and then indeed, if there is just one amount of money to be paid to the company, this can also lead to more predictability of the payments that is needed from a company point and from a government point of view. However, it's much more complicated than that. In many cases, medicines are not protected just via one patent or via one type of IP. No, many types of IP, many patents are linked to one medicine. Many license agreements are linked to one medicine. Often lawsuits are installed, and trade secrets play a large role if you think about medicines and medicine development. So just having one patent being transferred from the company to the government, for instance, is not a solution towards these type of problems. There also is no incentive for companies to step into one of these models. So it's also then the point, okay, how will we then incentivize companies to do this? Joint ownership, which is also one model, is regulated at the national level, and it has been shown that that type of models is also very complicated to enforce it. We still remain with a lot of uncertainty related, for instance, to the level of the lump sum, so the payment in advance that you need to pay for a certain investment, certain intellectual property rights. And indeed, it's also the risk is also that you will have a reduced level of investment in these very complicated ATMP development by companies. So you risk to de-incentivize the companies instead of incentivizing them. And still, clinical uncertainty will remain, whether or not you do something with these IP rights. And payers will be locked into contracts on a long base, which is also not the ideal way, knowing that uncertainties need to be clarified on the long term. So that's why indeed we need to reconsider very carefully these intellectual property right models before implementing them. There is a need to stimulate research and development and to address the uncertainties that we are still facing. And there is also a high need to share responsibilities, to share costs, and to come therefore by doing that to a reasonable pricing. And for instance, by creating much more public-private partnerships and early dialogues in the context of ATMPs, based on clear upfront agreements that cover commitments from both parties on shared investments, on productions, on liabilities, and on timing. And this also will increase certainty on that point in view of the reimbursements and the access to patients. So this is actually what is my contribution to this webinar. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, we are very open to ask to answer them. You may write your questions here in the question box as you see this. No questions yet? I have though a question while we are waiting for questions from the public. Maybe I can ask a question to you, Francis. So Francis, you talked about conditional marketing authorization, conditional reimbursement. And at the European level, there is then the concept of conditional marketing authorization. Is there a link?
Fundamentally different, actually. No.
Yes.
They're not. There's
Okay.
not a link between those two. The conditional marketing authorization is issued by a European Medicines Agency, and it puts conditions on marketing, on actually being available on the market or not. The conditions that we set is for drugs that, well, are fully on the market or not, or even conditioned on the market, but conditions where you have to, what Social Security has to do and what health insurance has to do is we're actually also looking for return on investment. You invest in health outcome for individual patients and health outcome for the whole population, but you have a limited budget available and limited financial resources available. So you have to set priorities, make choices, choose where to invest in and where not to invest in. So the conditional reimbursement, if we choose certain populations, a certain duration in time for certain treatment, certain dosages, not at all cost, any drug for all possible patients. That's not just to annoy the physicians that's not to annoy the physicians, the companies and the patients. Is because you have those limited resources and you have to set preferences. So that's the type. It's the drug can be used for any patient at any dosage for any time as a physician or a patient wants to do it, but Social Security thinks that it is most cost efficient and most efficient if you limit it to that type of patients, that duration, that dosage, and that indication. So it's different. There's difference between those two. There's no, most of the time, conditional marketing authorization is due to for safety reasons or efficacy reasons. There is actually no issue with efficacy or safety if we set conditions for reimbursement. Okay.
Yeah. Others?
It remains
Yeah,
very
are
much
there
silent.
Yeah. Is there anyone from the public who has some thoughts or some ideas to share about ATMPs and market access? As you know,
there are some questions now. The question box.
In the question box?
Okay.
Yes.
Oh.
Chat.
Just
I'm sorry, but
I don't see any questions.
I will read them out loud.
Okay.
It's imperative to know the cost of good to calculate the pricing. In my country, which is Estonia, I have seen companies are reluctant making the costs of goods public, and rather an approach is seen that we should have common pricing throughout Europe to avoid parallel import. I mean, would it be possible to reach a solution without knowing COG for the company?
That's probably a question for me, I suppose.
Yes.
Actually, I do not agree, but I have to. Yeah, it's one thing. I have to. It's sort of a disclaimer. I'm speaking for Belgium, and I'm speaking for the National Institute of Health and Disability Insurance. That means that we're actually quite a rich country. We're not a average payer country, actually. But well, saying that, there's a point in time where we have to be a little bit, so the payers or the buyers or the health insurance will have to be a bit more transparent on what we're willing to pay for a certain therapy also. And what you're willing to pay would not, and that's the example of the iPhone actually. You have to look at what is a drug worth for you. So what are you giving what you have to spend for the rest of your living? What are you willing to spend for that exact drug? And for that, you do not have to know what a drug costs.
Mm-hmm.
It is possible if we have to make payers. A lot of countries are in that conflict with the industry, where actually industry chooses for its price setting on or what would a country or what would a payer be willing to spend on that? What is the upper limit, going as high as possible? And then they're looking at the cost also. And companies tend to look at what is the highest result, the cost model or the value model, and they go for the highest result. And then the payers do exactly the same thing, but then the other way around. Look at the value model and look at the cost model and try to come up with the lowest possible price. Maybe there's a way in the middle somewhere where you have, which is actually completely value-based. And maybe we should go in that direction more. We did an exercise not that long ago well, not that long ago, except from a COVID year, in November 2019. I think with Benelux and then the Nordic countries, where we had an exercise on willingness to pay with 11 countries, actually, also with Canada and most of the Nordic countries. Switzerland was there, trying to come up with a willingness to pay, some sort of a threshold, minimum, highest and lowest threshold, or what we would be willing to pay for 2 advanced therapies that were not even on the market or only going to be on the market in 2 years or something. And actually it's doable. You can do that. So you do not know the cost structure, you do not know anything, and you come up with very fairly reasonable pricing. But that means negotiation based on something else, not go the limbo model, how low can you go, and then how high can you jump, and something in between. Then you get market, like Marrakesh market negotiations. Maybe we have to look at another model.
Okay,
I hope
there
that
is
answers.
another question. How early in the process should you engage with authorities? Which data evidence is needed?
Actually, there is already now a system of early engagement possible. So the European Medicines Agency in early development already offer the scientific advice procedure to companies. And it's the moment that indeed clinical trials will start up or can be designed and can be when people think of clinical development, that's already a point where interaction with regulators, with EMA, is possible and actually highly needed, because the European Medicines Agency will think about and will consider this trial design, will consider which patients are included in it, they consider the sample size, consider what type of indications that you use there, and so on. So it's very early in clinical development that the European Medicines Agency, that's the latest that you need to interact. That such interaction actually would be extremely valuable. And then I'm only talking about interaction with European Medicines Agency, which is actually today common practice for companies, but the early actions with the EMA and with the HTA and the payers, that's something, Francis, where you can maybe shed a light upon whether early interactions with the payers are also commonplace, especially for ATMPs.
Actually, also as soon as possible and as early as possible, and certainly for ATMPs, and actually it's happening already in very small pilots today. There is a meeting between EMA and the payers, I think next week or in 2 weeks or something like that. So we're trying to set that up, and that's also necessary very early. Why? Because the information, and that is something that I explained a little bit, the information that EMA needs, the medicines agency need, basically we need for payers, buyers, basically need the same information. We have to know if the drug works, we have to know how well it works, and we have to know if it's safe, but we also have to know what it does in clinical practice, not only in the circumstances of clinical trials. We have to know what it does as in comparison to the available therapeutic arsenal, to the best possible comparators. That is not information that is well, that type of information is not requested or not necessarily requested by marketing authorization authorities like EMA. So other types of studies, comparative studies, for instance, should be set up or are preferably set up. And if you engage very early, or if companies engage really early at the same time with payers, HTA people, and marketing authorization authorities, clinical studies are really, really expensive. And we are very much aware of that. To set them up, plus complicated to set them up, plus for ATMPs, especially complicated because you don't have that many expertise center, neither that many patients. So if you set them up, those types of studies, please study everything that you need to know for the whole life cycle. Plus the life cycle of the drugs themselves are changing. 20 years ago, you had the drug, then it was a little bit like the torpedoes on the old German submarines. You fire and forget. You put the drug on the market and then it's done. Nothing happens anymore. A bit of pharmacovigilance and that's it. Now we have actually continuous loops of information, evidence that is gathered, marketing authorization that is adapted a little bit and retargeted. There's new indications, there's other pathways, there's other combinations. You have continuous loop of information that is going round and round and round. You want to have everybody in the loop the whole time, including payers, investors, buyers. So from as soon as early as possible. That was a much too long answer.
Okay, a last question. If you rely on the willingness to pay, how to ensure that people with rare disease are also covered in the negotiation? Obviously, only 1 out of 100 people are concerned. People will be less ready to offer a price for such a treatment.
Is that true? We had I cannot respond individually to the person who asked the question, but is that actually true? The Belgians showed that they were willing to pay 2 million euro for a drug for an individual patient. Okay, they did that by paying 2 euro per person by SMS, but they actually show that. And there's also the aspect of solidarity and of I'm not certain that the willingness to pay for for orphan drugs might be lower. It might be even higher than what we are willing to pay today for very small indications and for very small patient groups. There's not a paradigm shift, but the discourse is changing a little bit by COVID. There's a lot more interest today in healthcare and investments in really high quality healthcare. Today, I do not know if that is going to be the case in a year when we will face other issues like the economical relance, and you will be, there's going to be a budgetary problem, huge budgetary problem. But still, I'm not that certain that willingness to pay would be that bad a deal for very small patient groups. I'm afraid that if you look at it from a health economic and a pharmacoeconomic point of view, so very much technical, which has been pleaded for a very long time, that at that point in time, we have hardly any orphan drugs that are cost efficient. We have hardly any cancer drugs that are cost efficient. If you use 40,000 euros or even 80,000 euros as a cost efficiency threshold. So maybe willingness to pay might help there.
Okay.
And then there was silence. Okay.
Then we are in the end of the webinar. We would like to thank you. Thank you to the two presenters for their very interesting presentations. Thank you for your questions, and thank you also, listeners, for your attention. Please have a look on our website where you can find a recording of this webinar. The slides will also be sent to you in the following days. You will also get a follow-up email with an evaluation form. We would really appreciate if you could fill it in. And then please note already two coming webinars in April, one on career coaching, which will be on what will happen after in the process after sending in your CV and motivation letter, what happens in the company, what do they do with that, what is interesting for them, etc. And another technical webinar on regulatory framework, which will be held on April 29th. We're looking forward to seeing you again and wish you a very happy day. Bye.